December 7, 1941, and Seaman First Class Robert Williams is eating breakfast in the mess hall of the USS Arizona, battleship BB-39, moored at Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and he is thinking about the fact that this is supposed to be a quiet Sunday morning. That most of the officers are ashore and that the ship is in a state of minimal readiness because Hawaii is thousands of miles from any war zone and because everyone knows that if Japan attacks it will be in the Philippines or maybe Malaya, but certainly not here, not at the home base of the Pacific Fleet where American battleships sit at anchor in neat rows like ducks on a pond. And Robert is drinking coffee and complaining with his shipmates about the quality of the powdered eggs when the first bomb hits and his world explodes in fire and chaos, and he realizes with absolute horror that America is under attack and that he has approximately 15 minutes left to live, though he does not know this yet. Robert is 19 years old, from a small town in Oklahoma, and he joined the Navy 8 months ago right after graduating from high school, partly because jobs were scarce during the Depression and partly because he wanted to see the world beyond Oklahoma, and the Navy seemed like a good way to get paid while traveling to exotic places. And Pearl Harbor has been exactly what he hoped for. Warm weather and beautiful beaches and relatively easy duty on a battleship that rarely leaves port, and he has been writing letters home to his parents and his girlfriend talking about how lucky he is to be stationed in paradise while war rages in Europe and Asia. The USS Arizona is a Pennsylvania-class battleship, 31,000 tons, commissioned in 1916, one of the oldest battleships in the Pacific Fleet but still formidable with 12 14-inch guns that can throw a 1,500-pound shell more than 20 miles. And Robert's battle station is in the forward magazine handling ammunition for Turret 2. Though in the 8 months he has been aboard they have never gone to general quarters for anything more serious than a drill. The explosion that rocks the ship at 07:55 is so powerful that Robert is thrown from his seat, and the lights go out for a moment, and then emergency lighting comes on, and men are shouting and asking what happened, and someone says it must be an accident, maybe the boilers exploded. But then the general quarters alarm starts sounding and Robert and 200 other sailors are running through passageways trying to reach their battle stations, and Robert can smell smoke and hear more explosions, and he realizes this is not an accident, this is an attack, and his mind cannot quite process this information because who would attack Pearl Harbor? Who would be insane enough to attack the United States Navy at its home base in Hawaii? He reaches his station in the forward magazine and finds gunner's mate Second Class Mike Thompson from Texas already there organizing the ammunition handling party. And Thompson is a 10-year Navy veteran who fought in China in the 1930s and who knows his business. And he is calmly giving orders to get ammunition up to the guns even though the ship is shaking from repeated impacts, and everyone knows something terrible is happening topside. Robert and 5 other sailors form a human chain passing 14-inch shells from the magazine to the hoist that will lift them up to Turret 2, and the shells weigh over 100 pounds each and handling them requires strength and coordination and concentration, and they work with practiced efficiency even though they can hear explosions and feel the ship shuddering and smell smoke that is getting thicker, and Robert is focused on his job. On lifting and passing the heavy shells, on not dropping one because dropping a 14-inch shell could detonate it and kill everyone in the magazine, and he does not have time to be afraid because the work demands all his attention and because training has taken over and he is functioning on autopilot, doing what he has been trained to do even though some part of his mind is screaming that they need to get out of here. That being deep in the bowels of a ship that is under attack is the most dangerous place possible. The order comes down from Turret 2 to cease fire, and Thompson asks over the sound-powered phones what is happening, and the voice on the other end says that they cannot train the turret, that something is wrong with the power or the hydraulics, and Thompson is swearing and trying to get information when a massive explosion tears through the ship. An explosion so powerful that it feels like the hand of God has picked up the Arizona and thrown it against the bottom of the harbor, and Robert is lifted off his feet and slammed into a bulkhead, and the lights go out completely, and there is a terrible groaning sound of metal tearing, and water is rushing in, and Robert realizes with sick certainty that the ship is sinking, that they are trapped in a magazine deep below the waterline, and that they are going to die here in the darkness unless they can get out right now. What Robert does not know, what he cannot know because he is trapped in the magazine, is that a Japanese bomb has penetrated the forward deck and exploded in the black powder magazine for turret 2, and this explosion has detonated over 1 million pounds of explosives stored in the forward magazines, and the resulting blast has essentially broken the ship in half, has killed over 1,000 men in an instant, has sent a fireball hundreds of feet into the air, and has turned the USS Arizona into a mass grave that will never be raised from the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Robert does not know any of this, knows only that he is in pitch darkness with water rising rapidly and men screaming and the air getting harder to breathe, and he is clawing his way toward where he thinks the exit is, following a wall with his hands because he cannot see anything, and the water is up to his waist now and rising fast. And he knows that he has maybe 60 seconds before the magazine floods completely, and everyone still inside drowns. He finds the ladder by pure luck, his hand hitting the bottom rung in the darkness, and he starts climbing, and other men are on the ladder too, a crush of bodies trying to get up, and someone above him is not moving fast enough and Robert wants to scream at them to hurry but cannot waste breath. And the water is at chest level now and the ship is listing heavily to port, and Robert is climbing one-handed because he needs his other hand to hold the ladder as the ship tilts, and he reaches the top of the ladder and emerges into a passageway that is full of smoke and lit by fires, and he can see daylight ahead through a hatch that has been blown open, and he runs toward that light because it represents escape, represents survival, represents the only way out of this floating coffin. Robert emerges onto the main deck and the sight that greets him is beyond anything his 19-year-old mind can comprehend, a vision of hell made real, a nightmare from which there is no waking. The forward part of the ship is gone, simply gone, nothing left but a massive crater where turrets 1 and 2 used to be, and flames are shooting hundreds of feet into the air, and the heat is so intense that Robert can feel his skin blistering even though he is 50 feet away, and bodies are everywhere, dead men and dying men and men who are so badly burned that they no longer look human, and the water around the ship is on fire. Fuel oil burning on the surface, and men are jumping off the ship into that burning water and screaming as they realize too late that they are jumping into an inferno. The USS Arizona is settling rapidly by the bow, the forward part sinking into the mud of Pearl Harbor, and the stern is rising out of the water, and Robert realizes that the ship is going down and that if he does not get off right now he is going to die either from the fires or from being trapped inside when the ship rolls over. He runs aft, toward the stern which is not yet completely engulfed in flames, and around him other survivors are doing the same desperate scramble for survival, and Japanese aircraft are still overhead. He can see them clearly now, bombers and torpedo planes and fighters with the red circle of the rising sun painted on their wings, and they are strafing the ships and the shore installations. And bullets are hitting the deck and ricocheting off metal, and Robert sees men cut down by machine gun fire from aircraft that swoops so low he can see the pilots' faces. He reaches the stern and without hesitation jumps off the ship into the water, and the water is warm and covered with fuel oil that coats his skin and gets in his mouth and eyes, and he swims away from the ship as fast as he can because he has been trained that when a ship sinks it creates suction that can pull swimmers down. And he is maybe 50 yards away when the Arizona settles completely onto the bottom of the harbor with a final groan of tortured metal, and the masts and superstructure remain above water, but most of the ship is submerged, and over 1,000 men are entombed inside, dead from the explosion or drowned or burned alive, and Robert Williams is one of perhaps 300 survivors from a crew of 1,500, one of the lucky ones who got off the ship before it became a grave. He swims through burning oil, trying to find a patch of water that is not on fire, and his lungs are burning from smoke inhalation and his skin is covered in oil and he is exhausted and in shock. But some survival instinct keeps him swimming, keeps him moving toward Ford Island where he can see other survivors gathering on the shore, and he makes it to shallow water and crawls onto the beach and collapses. And someone is dragging him further from the water, and he looks back at the harbor and sees that it is not just the Arizona that has been hit. The entire Pacific Fleet is under attack. Battleships and cruisers and destroyers are burning and sinking, and the air is full of smoke and the sound of explosions and the screams of wounded and dying men, and Robert understands that this is not just an attack, this is a catastrophe, this is the Pacific Fleet being destroyed while it sits helpless at anchor. And America is at war now whether it wants to be or not. The attack lasts for 2 hours, 2 waves of Japanese aircraft that methodically work their way through the ships and airfields of Oahu. And Robert Williams spends those 2 hours on the beach at Ford Island watching his ship burn and helping to pull other survivors from the water and trying to process the fact that just 90 minutes ago he was eating breakfast and complaining about eggs, and now he has no ship and most of his shipmates are dead and America is in a war that seems to have started with devastating Japanese success. The casualties from the Arizona alone will be over 1,100 killed, more than half the total American deaths at Pearl Harbor. And Robert will learn in the days and weeks that follow that 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were heavily damaged, almost 200 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and over 2,400 Americans were killed. And all of this happened in 2 hours on a Sunday morning when America was at peace and most service members were sleeping or eating breakfast or writing letters home. In the days immediately following the attack, Robert Williams and the other Arizona survivors are pressed into service helping with the massive cleanup and salvage operation, and he spends 2 weeks working 12-hour shifts pulling bodies from wrecked ships and cataloging personal effects and trying to identify remains that are sometimes so badly burned or damaged that identification is impossible. And this work is psychologically devastating, handling the bodies of men he knew, men he ate with and joked with and worked alongside, reducing them to names on casualty lists, and remains to be buried or sent home to grieving families. He volunteers for every extra duty he can find because staying busy keeps him from thinking too much about the fact that he should be dead. That pure random chance is the only reason he survived when Mike Thompson and so many others did not, and the survivor's guilt begins to set in, a weight that will grow heavier with each passing year rather than lighter. The Navy assigns Robert to a new ship in January 1942, a destroyer escort called the USS Samuel B. Roberts, and he reports aboard with a small canvas bag that contains everything he owns because everything else went down with the Arizona, all his personal possessions and photographs and letters from home, all the small things that connect a sailor to his life before the Navy. All gone to the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The Roberts is a brand new ship, just commissioned, and Robert is one of the few crew members with combat experience, which makes him valuable even though his combat experience consists of 15 minutes of chaos and horror followed by swimming through burning oil, and he finds himself training new sailors who are even younger than he is. Kids who are 18 or 19 and who look at him with something like awe when they learn he is a Pearl Harbor survivor, as if surviving makes him some kind of hero rather than just lucky. The Roberts spends 1942 on convoy escort duty, shepherding merchant ships across the Pacific, and this duty is tedious and exhausting, weeks at sea with nothing but ocean in every direction and constant vigilance against Japanese submarines that might be lurking below the surface. And Robert stands watches and runs drills and tries not to think about the Arizona, though of course he thinks about her constantly. Dreams about being trapped in the magazine with water rising, wakes up gasping and disoriented in his bunk. The ship participates in the Guadalcanal campaign, providing shore bombardment and anti-aircraft protection for the Marines fighting on the island, and Robert experiences combat again for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers attacking the American fleet and the Roberts maneuvering wildly to avoid bombs and torpedoes, and the terror he felt at Pearl Harbor comes flooding back. The helpless feeling of being attacked from the air with no way to strike back except with anti-aircraft guns that seem pitifully inadequate against determined enemy pilots. The war in the Pacific grinds on through 1943 and into 1944, and Robert participates in landings at Tarawa and the Marshalls and the Marianas, and each campaign follows the same brutal pattern: American forces assaulting Japanese-held islands, facing fanatical resistance from defenders who fight to the death, taking heavy casualties, moving on to the next island. And Robert sees enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes, sees landing craft full of Marines hit by artillery fire, sees kamikazes crash into American carriers, sees the aftermath of battles where Japanese soldiers choose suicide over surrender, and all of this accumulates in his mind, layer upon layer of trauma and horror, until he cannot remember what it felt like to not be at war, cannot imagine a future beyond the next battle. In October 1944, the Roberts participates in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, and Robert experiences 3 days of almost continuous combat as the American fleet engages the Japanese in a desperate attempt to prevent Japanese forces from disrupting the invasion of the Philippines. And on the third day of the battle, the Roberts, and a small group of other destroyer escorts and escort carriers find themselves facing a Japanese surface force that includes battleships and heavy cruisers, and every man aboard knows that this is a suicide mission, that their small ships with their 5-inch guns cannot hope to defeat Japanese battleships, but they attack anyway because the alternative is to let the Japanese reach the vulnerable escort carriers and troop transports. And for 2 hours the Roberts and her sister ships charge directly at the Japanese fleet, firing their guns and launching torpedoes and taking hit after hit from Japanese heavy guns, and Robert is at his battle station loading ammunition when a 14-inch shell from a Japanese battleship penetrates the Roberts' thin armor and explodes in the engine room, and the ship loses power and begins to list, and the order comes to abandon ship. Robert Williams goes into the water for the second time in the war, and this time there is no beach to swim to, just open ocean and Japanese ships firing at survivors in the water, and the knowledge that if rescue does not come soon they will either drown or be eaten by sharks that are attracted by the blood and bodies in the water. He floats in his life jacket for 14 hours before an American destroyer finds the survivors and pulls them from the water, and of the Roberts' crew of 224 men, only 90 survive, the rest killed in the battle or drowned or succumbed to wounds while floating in the water. And Robert learns that the Roberts and 2 other destroyer escorts and 1 escort carrier were sunk, but that their sacrifice bought time for American forces to defeat the Japanese fleet, and once again he has survived when other men died, and the survivor's guilt that has been building since Pearl Harbor becomes almost unbearable, a constant question of why him, what makes him special, why does he keep living when better men keep dying. Robert spends the rest of the war on shore duty, the Navy having decided that survivors of 2 ship sinkings have done enough, and he works at a training facility in San Diego teaching new sailors about damage control and firefighting, and he is good at this job because he has experienced the real thing twice, knows what it is like when your ship is sinking and you have seconds to make decisions that mean life or death. And the young sailors listen to him with respect, but teaching about war is very different from fighting in it. And Robert feels guilty about being safe in California while other sailors are dying in the Pacific, feels like he should be out there with them even though he knows this is irrational, that he has earned the right to sit out the rest of the war in safety. Robert Williams survives Pearl Harbor, and the Navy assigns him to a new ship, a destroyer escort, and he spends the next 4 years fighting across the Pacific, participating in invasions and convoy escort duties and anti-submarine patrols. And he fights at Guadalcanal and the Philippines and Okinawa, and he sees a lot of combat and a lot of death, but nothing ever affects him the way Pearl Harbor does. Nothing matches the shock and horror of that Sunday morning when the world changed in an instant and he went from peacetime sailor to combat survivor in the space of 15 minutes. He will have nightmares about being trapped in the magazine with water rising and no way out, will wake up screaming and sweating decades after the war ends, will never be able to smell fuel oil without being transported back to Pearl Harbor and swimming through burning water trying to escape the inferno. In the years after the war, Robert Williams will return to Pearl Harbor several times as part of survivor reunions, and he will visit the USS Arizona memorial that was built over the wreck of his ship, and he will stand on the white structure that spans the sunken hull and look down through the clear water at the rusted metal of the battleship where 1,100 of his shipmates still lie entombed. And he will cry for the friends he lost, for Mike Thompson who was in the magazine with him and who did not make it out, for the gunner's mates and fire control men and engineers and cooks and all the other sailors who died that morning, most of them younger than 25, most of them peacetime sailors who never imagined they would die in combat, and Robert will feel the weight of survivor's guilt, the question of why he lived when so many others died, a question that has no answer but that haunts him nonetheless. The USS Arizona Memorial becomes one of the most visited sites in Hawaii, a place where tourists come to pay respects and learn about the attack that brought America into World War II, and Robert will give interviews and talk to school groups and share his memories of that morning, and he will emphasize that Pearl Harbor was not just a military defeat, but a wake-up call, a demonstration that America was not immune to attack. That isolationism was not a viable policy in a world where aircraft carriers could strike across thousands of miles of ocean, and that the price of unpreparedness is paid in American lives. He will point out that the real lesson of Pearl Harbor is not about Japanese treachery or American negligence but about the need for constant vigilance, about the reality that wars do not start when nations declare them but when nations are ready to fight them, and that being caught unprepared gives the enemy an advantage that can cost thousands of lives. Robert Williams will live to age 92, dying in 2014, and his ashes will be interred aboard the USS Arizona with full military honors, laid to rest with his shipmates who died 73 years earlier, and this reunion in death will provide a sense of completion, a closing of a circle that began on that terrible Sunday morning in 1941. His family will attend the ceremony where divers place his ashes inside the wreck of the Arizona, and they will understand that while Robert lived a long and productive life after the war, part of him never left Pearl Harbor, part of him remained with the ship and the men who went down with her, and that his final wish to be returned to the Arizona represents not morbidity but a desire to rejoin his brothers in arms, to be with the crew of the ship that defined his life even though he served on her for less than a year. The USS Arizona herself remains in Pearl Harbor to this day, the rusted hulk slowly deteriorating in the warm salt water but still recognizable as a battleship, still leaking fuel oil that rises to the surface in small rainbow slicks that visitors call the tears of the Arizona, still holding the remains of over 900 sailors who were never recovered because the Navy decided that the ship itself would be their tomb and their memorial. The battleship that was sunk on December 7, 1941 became a symbol of American resolve, a reminder of the cost of the war and the sacrifice of those who died in it, and a warning to future generations that freedom is never free, that vigilance has a price but that the price of complacency is far higher, and that the men who died at Pearl Harbor gave their lives in a cause that was just even though they died before they could fight for it, killed in a surprise attack that galvanized a nation and transformed America from isolationist democracy to arsenal of democracy to victor in the greatest war in human history. Robert Williams would want people to remember not just that Pearl Harbor happened but why it matters, not just the date that will live in infamy but the lessons that infamy teaches, not just the ships that were sunk but the men who died on them, sailors who had names and families and dreams and futures that were stolen from them on a Sunday morning in paradise, and whose sacrifice bought time for America to mobilize and fight back and ultimately win a war that seemed lost in those first terrible hours when the Pacific Fleet burned and died at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the day that America's isolationism ended and America's role as a global superpower began, a transformation paid for in the blood of 2,400 Americans who died that morning and in the determination of survivors like Robert Williams who vowed that they would never be caught unprepared again, that the lesson of Pearl Harbor would be learned and remembered and passed on to future generations who would understand that freedom requires eternal vigilance, and that the price of peace is the willingness to fight for it when peace is threatened by those who seek to impose their will through violence and aggression.